Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour.
Welcome back to the Progress Texas Happy Hour. I'm Progress Texas Advocacy Associate Tatum Owens. House Republicans just passed the SAVE Act, or H.R. 22, which doesn't save anything. It only makes it extremely difficult to vote and could disenfranchise millions of Americans from their constitutional right to pick their leaders. This bill came from Texas' very own Chip Roy, and its proposed aim to ban undocumented immigrants from voting, which is already illegal, pales in comparison to the wide-reaching voter suppression this bill would enact if put into law. It would institute barriers that range from long lines at the polls to removing you from voting records or rolls, and effectively, your right to vote with your registration. There are already federal and state laws that protect our elections and their integrity. Yet, the SAVE Act would institute needless requirements for all Americans to show a document, such as their birth certificate or passport, proving their U.S. citizenship with their current legal name on it, in order to register or re-register to vote. This puts the right to vote at risk for the 150 million U.S. citizens without a passport, the 21.3 million Americans, or almost 1 in 10 voting age citizens, who do not have easy access to these documents, plus the elderly born outside of hospitals and without birth certificates, and even married women whose legal names are different than that on their birth certificate. Overall, millions of Americans could lose their right to vote. There is a reason that this bill that threatens so much nationally for voting rights originated right here in Texas. Our state is one of the hardest states to vote in by design, ranking at 46th in the nation for voting access, and extremist politicians like Chip Roy, but worse, are only making it harder. Voting in Texas should be easy and accessible, but voters are left with no option but to plan 30 days ahead of every election day to stay informed on constantly changing registration and voting deadlines, election laws, and limited polling locations, plus the normal task of who and what's on their ballot. This 89th legislative session and beyond, Texas has an opportunity to restore and expand our voting power and improve the election system for every voter. How? By supporting Representative John H. Busey III's House Bills 2082 and 5258, also known as the Barbara Jordan Texas Voting Rights Act, or Texas VRA. These bills propose overdue, proven solutions that will protect Texas voters from suppression, discrimination, and intimidation, expand election infrastructure, and increase access and turnout to ensure every Texas voter can fully participate in our democracy through free, fair, and secure elections. Today, we are joined by Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, or LDF, Christina M. Esquire, the Texas Civil Rights Project's TCRP's Voting Rights Policy Attorney, Veronikah Warms, and Policy Director for Common Cause Texas, Eby French, JD, on why Texas can and should lead the nation in protecting the right to vote and promoting inclusive democracy by adopting the Texas VRA. Let's hear more from our guests, Christina, Veronikah, and Emily. Thank you all so much for joining.
Thanks for having us. I'm excited to be amongst this group of some of the best voting lawyers in the game, if I could be so humble.
I love it. Thank you, Emily. Let's start first with some introductions. Our growing coalition for the Texas VRA currently includes the LDF, TCRP, Common Cause Texas, Texas Freedom Network, Texas Rising Action, Asian Texans for Justice, Clean Elections Texas, Engage Action, Houston Area Urban League, Jolt Action, and more to come. For our guests today, though, could we start off the conversation with each of you telling us briefly about your organization and its commitment to solidifying voting rights in Texas? Let's hear from Christina, then Veronikah, then Emily.
Thanks so much, Tatum. Happy to be here. And I am, of course, representing LDF, the Legal Defense Fund. We are a historic civil rights organization dedicated to building Black political power and uplifting the dignity of every Black Texan has been a priority of my work for the past 3 years. Our work spans across political participation, education equity, economic justice, and also criminal justice. We are here to ensure that criminalization of the ballot box, undue prosecution of Black voters, and the limitations that Black voters are facing nationwide are being systemically resolved. We do that through a combination of litigation, policy, and organizing efforts. So I'm joining you from New York, but I like to consider Texas my second home. Again, I've been working there for several years, and LDF has a storied history in Texas, starting with our litigation in Smith v. Allwright and Sweat v. Painter, and continuing to do this work through the ongoing litigation in the Senate Bill 1 case that we've been working on with TCRP. So I'll pass it along.
Thank you so much, Christina. And my name is Veronikah Warms. I am a voting rights policy attorney at the Texas Civil Rights Project. We've been a 501c3 nonprofit since 1990, and we have three principal programs. We have our criminal legal program, our Beyond Borders program that focuses on human rights for immigrants in our system, and our voting rights program. And we use a combination of litigation and campaigning at the Pink Building, which I am at routinely these days, to make sure that every single Texas voter who's eligible has the right to vote and the ability to actually exercise that right, which is currently and consistently under attack from a ton of different election laws that have either been implemented or are being discussed right now in the Texas legislature. So as Senate Bill 1 being one of them, and we've been really thankful to have such amazing partners like LDF in that litigation and helping protect Texas voters. And I'll pass it on to Emily.
Thanks, Veronikah. I'm Emily Eby French. I use she, her pronouns, and I am at Common Cause Texas. Common Cause is a national organization. We were founded in 1970 after the LBJ administration by one of LBJ's cabinet members to be the people's lobby. So that's what we try to do. We are all about holding power accountable. We've got, we work on voting rights, but also campaign finance, ethics, transparency, all those issues like that to really make our democracy more direct. We have offices across the United States, everywhere from Rhode Island to Nebraska to California to Florida, and we are working on democracy in all of those areas. I am very happy to be part of the Texas team with my three colleagues and with my expanded coalition of colleagues that includes TCRP, LDF, Progress Texas, and many other great folks.
Thank you so much for sharing, all of you. Next, let's dive into the Texas VRA. That's what we're here for. Christina, then Veronikah. Could you please introduce the Texas VRA to our audience, sharing what the two bills propose, what that looks like enshrined in state law, and why it's so important?
Happy to do so. I love talking about the VRAs, and particularly the Texas VRA, which, if enacted, would be the nation's leading voting rights act with such robust protections, as you mentioned, Tatum, against discriminatory vote dilution and voter suppression. I'm happy to go into those terms more as we talk today. It would enact a pre-clearance program that would restore as we know, the provisions of Section 5 that were gutted by Shelby County versus Holder nearly more than 10 years ago now that have had such a drastic effect on voters in Texas. It would expand language access for voters with limited English proficiency, which is so exciting in a state like Texas, which has the highest rate of growth and new transplants to Texas every single day. We want to ensure that voters of every background that are limited English proficient are able to participate in our democracy effectively. And the Texas VRA would do that by lowering the federal thresholds and expanding language access to meet the needs of diverse communities across the state. The VRA would also implement a central public repository for election and demographic data with the goal of fostering transparent, evidence-based practices. Now, for my voting rights nerds, this is really important because, as you can imagine, working with organizations like Common Cause and TCRP, we're often submitting open records requests or doing research to try and understand how the current election laws are affecting Texas voters. With this database, we will be not only saving so much money, avoiding open records requests and administrative hurdle, we're also going to house this at a public university, really ensuring that we're building a pipeline for future young people to be involved in our elections and our civic engagement. Finally, we can't end talking about the VRA without talking about the prohibitions on voter intimidation, deception, and obstruction. What that means is that in this ever-changing climate where we are seeing magnified attempts at disinformation and misinformation that we saw highlighted in the 2024 election and prior, the VRA will ensure that we have proactive tools in addition to the federal tools like Section 11B and the KKK Act to prohibit voter intimidation, voter deception, and to obstruct access to the ballot box, particularly for eligible voters and, as we know, communities of color who are often faced with disproportionate barriers to vote. Finally, the democracy canon will instruct Texas judges on how to interpret and apply state laws in favor of robust and equal access for all voters and really putting democracy first. So I will close with that on the VRA and pass it over to Veronikah to talk a little bit more about our elections omnibus bill.
Absolutely. So for folks that are not constantly running in and out of the Capitol, an omnibus bill just means a bill that covers a lot of different aspects of a specific area of law. So basically anything in the subject matter can get addressed in the bill. And what our goal with the omnibus voter bill was essentially to improve access for all Texans. Currently, Texas is one of only, I believe, 8 states that doesn't have online voter registration. This would enshrine that into law, as well as give people the opportunity to do automatic voter registration when they sign up for a driver's license or apply for a DPS ID, and enshrine same-day voter registration into law, which also really helps our young people participate in our democracy. It will also expand the types of identification that folks can present at the polls in order to actually access their right to vote, to IDs that aren't currently included, such as student IDs and tribal IDs, and that really disenfranchise folks as the law currently stands. It also expands vote by mail to be universal, right? Currently, Texas is one of the few states that still requires an excuse in order to access vote by mail. Currently, you either have to be sick or present with a disability or be over 65, meet very specific conditions, right, to be able to access that right. And this would expand that so that anybody could avail themselves of their right to vote without having to meet one of those higher bars. It also ensures more access to the polls for our folks with disabilities. It would allow for voters with disabilities who have any kind of visual impairment or what have you to access an electronic version of the ballot, which would allow them to use screen reader technology to actually read their ballot and mark it and effectuate their right to vote through secrecy of the ballot, which is really important to everybody and which I hear about constantly and in the pink building. So I think that folks should be supportive of letting people with any kind of visual impairment being able to access the secret ballot. It enshrines so many important voter protections, and we are really excited to see this being presented so that all eligible Texans can effectuate the right to vote.
Thank you for sharing, Christina and Veronikah. And Veronikah, thank you for breaking down. I know that we're all voting rights nerds in here, but an omnibus bill is not a term that everybody knows. And that's so crucial to make sure that our audience understands exactly what we're talking about. And especially when we're talking about voting rights, this gets into state and federal laws that not everybody's going to know. Thank you for doing the work. And for our next question, let's move on to the context behind the bills. Anti-democracy legislators have increasingly reduced access to the polls. We've already touched on this because they are afraid of the power of Texans. SB 1 is a notable example for its restrictions of state election laws, criminalization of voter assistance, and limits to vote by mail and county election options. And so much more is at risk if we don't take action now. Emily, Veronikah, then Christina, would you please tell us more about the landscape of voting rights in Texas and how Texas voters face persistent barriers to the ballot box, like discrimination and voter suppression that are built into our state laws?
Absolutely. I've been doing voting rights work since I got out of law school in 2018. I know that there are folks who've been doing it a lot longer, folks who have been doing it less time. The more I do this work, the more I come to the conclusion that the leaders of Texas do not want you to vote. And I think they don't really care about which party they are disenfranchising as long as they are disenfranchising people, right? They want that pool of voters to get smaller and smaller. The 20th century was all about like more rights for people. There were, Native American rights to vote weren't expanded all the way until I think 1964 across the, indigenous people across all the states. Of course, women got the right to vote in with the 19th Amendment. And, I don't believe that Black people in America meaningfully had the right to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that was just expanding circles. Texas, they want to shrink those circles all the way back down to like white landowning males. If you were like trying to buy a hamburger from a business that sells hamburgers, and they were like, 30 days before you're going to want a hamburger, we need you to come down here and fill out a bunch of information and show us some documents to prove that you can get a hamburger. And then you will only be able to get a hamburger between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., but you're going to have to look up where you can get a hamburger, and it's not going to be the same hamburger restaurant as the last place you got a hamburger. You just wouldn't get a hamburger. That's a terrible business model. And if you want somebody to access something, you don't hide it behind like the hurdles and boundaries, like barriers like that. But Texas, of course, keeps putting up hurdles and barriers to voting because they don't want you to access it. And for folks like us, we are all about making sure that folks can get that right, making sure that we help people solve issues. We, side plug, we all help run the 866-R Vote hotline where folks can call if they have an issue, like no matter how small. But normal people who have lives and jobs and are trying to like survive all the other horrors that are going on in the world and the economy don't have time to research all of this stuff that we already know. They don't have time to jump 6 hurdles. Maybe they have time to jump 5. So the Texas legislature is all about putting up extra hurdles. When a county like Harris County in 2020 tries to respond to things like the pandemic and say, we're going to do we're going to do drive-through voting. We're going to read the election code so that we can have these mail-in ballot drop boxes. We're going to mail folks mail-in voter applications who, if they're eligible. When a county tries to reach out and take down some of those hurdles, the legislature targets them, like the election officials personally and the county, and makes it so that you can't take down those hurdles anymore. I think our election officials are very good at still working through those things, but the voting rights landscape is incredibly hostile to voters in Texas. I love the Barbara Jordan Voting Rights Act bills for how many barriers, like big picture and small picture, these bills would knock down if they became law.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that amazing introduction and for the shameless plug for the election protection hotline, 866-R Vote. Please remember, we have May elections, everyone. The voting rights landscape in Texas is, as Emily just described, is incredibly hostile to voters actually effectuating their right to vote. We see it every single election cycle that I've worked since 2022, which is not that many, but plenty enough to see the level of disenfranchisement. In the 2024 election cycle, I can tell you that on the election protection hotline, apart from routine voter questions and what have you that we answer, really concerningly, a lot of the top complaints were about disability access issues and voter intimidation. And that should simply not be the case, right? Like being able to actually access the polling place, being able to access, poll workers who actually know the law and can help you through the process, being able to actually be able to show up at the polling place without being afraid of being intimidated for just exercising your constitutional rights. I think that this act is going to make it so much easier and a lot less scary to vote in Texas, since we've seen the history that not only from, the past 40 years, but even in relatively recent history, we've seen folks prosecuted for making simple mistakes during the voting process. We have a very zealous AG who has been halted a bit by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, although, of course, the legislature is trying to break down that barrier as well to let him go after people. So adding these statutory protections is so important for people to be able to actually access the ballot box, especially when there are people who have the power to scare people and disenfranchise them based on the laws that are currently on the books. And frankly, I think abusing those laws in a lot of cases. So I will pass it to Christina.
Thanks, both. I'll just piggyback off of a few things that Emily and Veronica have already said, and also underscore that the Texas VRA, it really is a bold vision for the future of Texas. Texas has limitless potential and some of the best advocates that I've worked with nationwide, and people are relentless. And so in passing the VRA, we will be able to counteract many of the fear-mongering and intentional discrimination tactics that Emily and Veronica have highlighted, but also take a real stab at envisioning equity for all Texans. And that means particularly, I want to highlight the voter dilution protections. Just last year in Galveston, we had a years-long trial in which our colleagues at CLC and other partner organizations were litigating to ensure that Black and Latino voters in Galveston County had equal representation when it came to local redistricting and that challenge on political maps, particularly attacked the attempt of coalitions of racial or ethnic groups to launch a voter dilution claim. And so for those that don't know, and I'll give some background, voter dilution happens when an election system or policies are in place that deny voters of color an equal opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. So it's different than vote denial in that eligible voters are prevented from voting altogether. But in vote dilution scenarios, you really do see that despite large swaths of communities of color, they are not represented in a leadership level, such as the case in Galveston County, where there were at-large elections. And I say all that to say that in a system like at-large elections, which has been proven to have discriminatory or disparate impact on Black voters and minority voters from electing a candidate of their choice, because it is a broad at-large election rather than a district-based election, we know that Black voters won't be represented and their needs won't be met. And so the VRA directly addresses this by creating robust protections for vote dilution and really enshrining the protections from the Federal Voting Rights Act. So there are real implications here, and they're close to home for many of you in Texas.
San Antonio friends, Progress Texas is proud to welcome Mayor Ron Nierenberg as our guest for a live podcast taping at our Party for Progress on Tuesday, May 6th, and you're invited. We look forward to a long overdue visit to Alamo City. Again, mark that date, Tuesday, May 6th, live pod taping with Mayor Ron Nierenberg and good fun with you in San Antonio. See the show notes and get your tickets right now. And thanks to Austin Kaplan and the Kaplan Law Firm, Julianne Reeves, Tracy Miller, Will Judy, and more for their generous support of our San Antonio Party for Progress.
The Texas VRA proposes comprehensive remedies that Christina has just outlined to restore and expand Texans' voting power, with a major focus on creating a more modern election system that suits our changing state. Modernizing voter registration, which is not only good for our democracy, but great for our pocketbooks, would save taxpayers money and decrease errors in the archaic paper registration process. Veronikah, then Emily, please move from our last question about voting rights generally to talking about the state of our election system, how it's simultaneously expensive and underfunded, outdated, and increasingly exclusive.
Absolutely. So one thing that I think people don't really realize from the outside is just how horribly antiquated our election procedures are. We only have voter registration by paper, essentially. You can update your voter registration online, but you can't actually register to vote for the first time online, which is extremely confusing, especially since the forms are available in a fillable format online. But there's actually a bill up right now to actually add a pop-up box to remind you to print that voter application and send it in to actually effectuate your voter registration. It's extremely confusing. And as you can imagine, a lot of people fill out these forms in person at DPS when they are, applying for an ID or their driver's license. People's handwriting varies, right? There can be errors with transcription, even when you're putting down all of your information correctly. And we saw the consequences of a lot of our antiquated election procedures when SB1 was implemented, right? For those who aren't enmeshed in this as much as we are all the time, SB1 added new requirements to vote by mail applications and carrier envelopes, and required you to put down your driver's license or personal ID number, or if you didn't have that, the last four of your social security number. And if you didn't have that, you could check a box. But this led to a lot of erroneous rejections, or a lot of rejections for no particular reason, because the county's database wasn't updated to what the voters' actual ID numbers were, right? Maybe you registered before 2008 and you registered with your social security number and didn't remember that, and you put down your driver's license number, but the voter registrar didn't have a record of that driver's license number. All of a sudden, your application or to vote by mail would be rejected, right? Because the numbers simply didn't match the county's records. Things like this are really pedantic, and they don't make any difference on whether someone is actually eligible to vote, right? You're essentially getting denied your right to vote because of a paperwork error. We live in a modern society now. We are currently on a podcast that is broadcasting over the internet and being recorded and being updated. We do pretty much everything in our lives via online means. Being able to actually just input directly into the system and then have state folks, dot their I's and cross their T's and all that, just makes logical sense, right? It's more secure because people can actually make sure that they don't have those transcription errors, make sure that everything is above board and what have you. And it also just reduces the amount of paper that DPS has to process and stops delays in the voter ID process. So that is kind of in a nutshell some of the antiquation that we see going on. And I'll let Emily expound on some of the other ways that our voter systems are unfortunately underfunded and under-resourced.
I love going after Veronikah. She always does such a good job, and I just get to be like, same. But I totally agree. And I think actually, now that I'm thinking about it, can we get like an amendment in the Barbara Jordan Voting Rights Act that's like any representative or senator who wants us to stay on paper voter registration must also themselves personally transfer back to paper banking and not be able to bank online anymore? We do so many things that are secure online. Why is voter registration not one of them? We know that the state can handle it. We have driver's license transactions. There's all kinds of secure things in that process. Why don't we just go to online voter registration? And like Veronikah said, a lot of these things, and Christina too, we've all said this, you kind of have to be the election code whisperer to know how to vote in Texas, right? Like any like step along the way, you could encounter some problem that like you might be the first or second or fifth person ever in the history of the state of Texas to encounter this problem, because we're all such a different combination of like ID numbers and situations and personal circumstances that you have to figure out how to weave in and out of these Texas laws. And I'll just add, we do have folks in Texas who are election code whisperers. They are our local election officials, right? Everybody, no matter what county you're in, you have an elections official who knows a lot about the election code, who is doing their best. When we talk about underfunded, elections departments in counties are so underfunded. And the state keeps proposing and passing laws that they are not giving more funding to counties to implement. And it's so frustrating to see these counties doing their best, trying to modernize, trying to make sure that they type in all of the names correctly from your voter registration form. And the state just keeps piling more and more on them. A couple years ago, everybody in Gillespie County in the elections department just quit. They were like, we're done. And they all walked out, which is, upsetting and frustrating. But at some level, who could blame them? There's so little support. They are constantly accused by conspiracy theorists, which we could do a whole nother podcast about the Texas election conspiracy theory pipeline. But election workers are some of our best resources in this fight, and they are constantly getting threatened to be criminalized by the election code, by new laws. They are constantly getting underpaid and extended far beyond what they're able to do. They are superheroes, but they shouldn't have to be.
Constantly put in a position of being underfunded and outdated. Thank you both for sharing a little bit more about our elections system. Our next question opens up our next question is pivoted. Our next question is pointed to everybody on the call to talk about other bills that pertain to our elections and voting rights. Each of your organizations has organized around the SAVE Act in the U.S. Congress and SB 8 or HB 5580 in the Texas Ledge. Could you share your thoughts about specific narratives you're seeing in our legislative bodies that relate to voting access, plus more on specific bills you've been following those mentioned?
Sure. Happy to jump in. SB 16 is Texas's version of the SAVE Act and is somehow even worse, which is saying something. But essentially, it means that if you don't have very specific types of ID to prove your citizenship, and if the state doesn't actually have a record of those IDs, which is a very important caveat there, then you could be either removed from the voter rolls on the basis of non-citizenship, or you could be put on a really esoteric list, which I will go on to explain. It's called a limited federal ballot. And if you are put on that limited federal ballot, then you will only be able to vote for the seats for U.S. Congress. If you want to know that's right, you couldn't vote for president. If you want to know why you couldn't vote for president, it's a really strange and interesting legal theory. I'll just say interesting in quotes there, that because we are voting for the state electors when we are voting for president, we are not actually voting for a federal office. So that is the legal theory, but I think it's completely, to use the technical legal term, banana pants crazy. And yeah, essentially, that is one of the things that it would do if the county registrar doesn't have access to a database that can confirm whether you are a citizen or not. If there is a record anywhere in the databases that this bill gives the county access to that at one time a voter wasn't a citizen, right? Like maybe you were a legal permanent resident and you applied for a driver's license and you've since become a naturalized citizen, right? You have gone through the process to actually become a US citizen. If that hasn't been updated in the records that the county has access to, then that person could get flagged, forwarded to the Attorney General for prosecution, and potentially be in line for criminal charges for essentially paperwork problems. It's absurdly punitive. I think it's going to really increase long lines because it completely changes how the in-person voting process is going to work. Also, if you're on that limited federal ballot list, you can't vote by mail. You have to vote in person and use this completely different process. It's also going to take counties a lot longer to process these results, right? Because as the bill outlines, you have to use they're going to use the normal ballot, right, that everybody else gets. But if they don't have the right citizenship information for you, then they have to go through and physically cross out each race that you are not allowed to vote in. Just adding that time alone on top of any of the other procedures is going to increase the time that it takes for counties to actually produce these election results, and it is an unfunded mandate. If they need to hire more people to actually effectuate these processes, and also to translate my legalese, an unfunded mandate means that the legislature, the state is saying, hey, county, you have to do this, right? But we're not going to actually give you the money to do it. We are just going to say, hey, county, you are going to be violating the election code if you don't somehow figure out how to come up with the money to do this. And what that usually means is that people's property taxes increase because counties have to come up with the money from somewhere. And that money usually comes from you, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah. And I think anytime there is something that saves counties money, if it makes things easier for voters, the legislature might try to attack that too. Which is like, these are your own counties. These people work for, anyway. So some of the things that we're worried about in the ledge are attacks on countywide polling. Countywide polling is a program that has expanded across Texas. It's been incredibly popular over the last 10 or so years. It means basically that everybody in that county can vote at any polling place in their county on election day. During early voting, that's how every county in Texas is. You can vote at the polling place near your kid's school where you drop them off, or the polling place near your work, or the polling place near your home. There have been attacks on countywide polling. They are incredibly unpopular. SB 76 was heard in the Senate State Affairs Committee a couple of weeks ago, and SB 76 would just outlaw countywide polling point blank. There were 337 people who registered against that bill, like citizens and counties and folks who came in to say, we hate this, and only 25 people who registered for it, which is pretty bad if they could only get 25 people compared to 337. So that bill is still pending in the Senate State Affairs Committee because they know that eliminating countywide polling is unpopular across the board. But I think what they're trying to do is get in through the back door, do some kind of sneaky way to either make countywide less compelling to counties, less helpful to voters, or eliminate it through some backdoor means. There's a bill, HB 4275, that on its face looks like a good bill. It would require a polling place, a countywide polling county would have to have a polling place in every precinct on election day. That looks great. But the reality is that it eliminates all the cost savings from the countywide polling program, which is part of what makes it so appealing to counties. They are able to cut some polling places. And of course, our groups are always saying, hey, don't cut polling places in neighborhoods, people of color, people with disabilities, don't cut these polling places. That's an ongoing advocacy battle. But the reality is you just need fewer polling places if people can vote at any polling place. So I think HB 4275 is trying to sneak in through the back door and make countywide polling more expensive so counties like it less so they can get rid of it. There are a couple other bills that are trying to eliminate e-poll books, which is the electronic check-in system. Of course, if you run like a big paper check-in book, there's no way to refresh that to say like, hey, Christina Das voted at, Maple Elementary School. Christina Das can't then go across the street and vote at, the West Gray Multi-Service Center. And that live e-poll book refreshes that to make sure that people aren't voting twice, which isn't really a problem anyway, but it's good to have that protection in place. If they eliminate e-poll books, you can't do countywide polling because you can't have that live updating check-in. So watching out for any things like that. The counties really love countywide polling. The voters love countywide polling. There's this wonderful elections administrator in, I believe, Chambers County, which is near Houston. And she's a huge advocate for countywide polling because Chambers County is like here, and then there's a long bridge, and here's the rest of Chambers County. And Harris County, which is Houston, is here. A lot of people who live in Chambers County drive across that bridge to work in Harris County. But if the bridge is out, they can only get to these parts of Chambers County after work to vote. And that election administrator said, if that bridge goes out, we need countywide polling to make sure everybody gets to cast their ballot. So that's something that we're watching and worrying about too.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, it's a matter of instituting these measures to make sure every voter can get to the polls and that those polls are open for them in the first place. I have a question for Christina specifically, pivoting from the question on the SAVE Act and nationally what's going on with voting rights. I'd love to hear more about that and your work with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, working to help other states build their own VRA.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. And just want to highlight again the cost of elections, and particularly with SB 16, Veronikah did a great job talking about the costs for counties and the disproportionate impact. I just want to highlight that Texas still has a $7.25 hourly minimum wage, and the cost of getting some of these documents, namely a passport or a citizenship document, is upwards of $22 to $175. So for working class Texans who are making minimum wage, which is the reality because Texas will not raise that wage, we are asking working families to spend more than a day's work or earning to have documents to participate in their democracy. That cost matters, right? And that's food on the table, especially in an economy that's suffering. And so again, democracy should not have barriers and more costs to participate. So turning to this national level, I'm really excited for the question. LDF has been an organization that is leading the effort for state voting rights acts nationwide. In the past 5 years, we have implemented a state voting rights act in every year other than 2020, the year of the obviously disastrous pandemic. And so we are now working and have successfully passed state voting rights acts in my home state of New York, neighboring Connecticut, Minnesota. We have ongoing campaigns in Michigan, a really, really close campaign right now in Maryland. And we are excited that an Illinois Voting Rights Act has been introduced. And I never forget about the South. We have a robust Voting Rights Act that has been introduced in Florida, possibly a state that maybe gives Texas a run for their money with regard to barriers to elections. That state did actually have a hearing, so Texas has some work to do on the Florida Voting Rights Act and the protections that it would enact. And so I've named 7 or 8 states, we are really galvanizing on the movement that it started in California and Virginia on state voting rights acts, really being the forefront of protections for voters, given this post-Shelby County climate. And so this work is exciting. It is coalition-based, and we always talk to state-level experts like Emily, Veronikah, and their organizations, and obviously need community-based and educational work like this podcast to be done to make sure that people understand how state voting rights acts work. It is oftentimes a years-long effort in the legislature. And we are ensuring that it is a racial and ethnic coalition that supports these voting rights acts. In Connecticut, we're actually in a battle to fund the Voting Rights Act. So there are challenges nationwide to ensure that these improvements take place. But we're really heartened by the efforts and really excited to be doing this, especially in the great state of Texas. Thank you.
So just a really quick Cliff Notes version for non-lawyers on Shelby County v. Holder, which is the short version essentially is that before 2013, there was this whole process set up by the Voting Rights Act where states with a history of discrimination against specific marginalized groups in voting were put under a preclearance regime, which basically means every time that a state that met this criteria passed a law that affected voting rights or what have you, it would have to go up to the Department of Justice or a 3-judge district panel and get reviewed to make sure that it wouldn't negatively impact those marginalized communities. After the Shelby County v. Holder decision, Chief Justice John Roberts said, everything's fine now. There's no discriminatory voting laws. Therefore, we don't need this protection anymore, which, as RBG famously said, is like throwing out your umbrella in a rainstorm. It's essentially the idea that we don't need that legal protection anymore because we are not seeing any more discriminatory voting laws, but we're not seeing any discriminatory voting laws because that preclearance regime is in there, which is why it's so important the work that LDF is doing in instituting that kind of review process state by state, since the federal government hasn't been doing that.
The day after Shelby County the decision came down, Texas imposed their strict voter ID law, which we're still suffering under today. And that within the next couple of years, 750 polling places were closed across the state of Texas alone, most of those in Black and Latinx neighborhoods.
Y'all have done such an amazing job at painting the broad picture of why we need the Texas VRA urgently to protect against voter suppression, intimidation, and discrimination largely. Our last question for each of our guests here today takes a look backward and into the future. Could you share how you got involved with the Texas VRA, why you support it, and what you think people need to know about how it could benefit Texans? Christina, would you start?
Absolutely. So I obviously got involved with the Texas VRA because I am a voting rights attorney at LDF, and we have been working and shepherding this VRA effort nationally. But on a more personal note, I have gotten involved in voting rights work and think that the VRA is the best avenue forward for Texas voters and for first-time voters and new Americans like my family, because I had monumental experiences in my life, like helping family members trying to translate ballots or other documents. And I understand the barriers that immigrants face when trying to participate in everyday life, let alone democracy in this country. I come from an organizing background and like to be an organizer attorney. And so I'm really excited to bring years of coalition work and organizing work to really meet the moment for our country and in Texas, especially given everything going on nationally with the SAVE Act being voted out of committee. So that's my story, and I'm really excited to work with you all on the Texas VRA. I'll pass it over to Emily.
Yeah, I mean, a lot. There's not too much more I can add except the thing I love. I love all the stuff we've gotten into the Texas Voting Rights Act, but the thing that I keep coming back to is the democracy canon. We talked about it earlier. Basically, it says that when an election case comes up before a judge, they have to interpret these rules and state laws, the ones in the Voting Rights Act and the ones that already existed before it. They have to interpret these in favor of the voter, in favor of robust and equal access to the ballot wherever possible. That voter forward stance is so important to me. It's something that we don't have in Texas. People get bogged down with what about ballot security? What about election integrity? All of these dog whistles to keep people out of the ballot box. But what matters the most to me is helping these individual voters, these folks that we all talk to on the election protection hotline, interpreting election laws and interpreting the voting process to be in favor of these eligible, good faith voters who just want to say in their democracy. Turning the tide and changing the position in Texas to be voter forward rather than anti-voter is really important to me. I'm really excited that the Voting Rights Act is working towards that.
And I mean, I concur with both of my colleagues here and would just add that I'm really excited about the Texas VRA because it advances the reason that I got into voting rights in the first place, right? I was working in the Texas legislature. I was seeing all the policies that were going through, and I wanted to be a legislative attorney for that reason. But you start to realize as you go through the law and go through all of the barriers that currently exist, that there is no way to really effectuate policy and actually represent Texans if you don't have access to the ballot box. Like, that is thing one. And then you can actually make the policies that actually work for Texans, and people can actually have people represent them that reflect their values, right? And I think that that is at the core of our democracy, and it's really what this Texas VRA is trying to accomplish. And I think that I couldn't think of a better draft.
I'm so glad to be in this coalition with each of you, voting rights experts, each to yourselves. And I think that Texas will be better off when the Texas VRA gets passed, whether it's this legislative session or onward. Thank you all for joining us today, sharing this vital work with our audience. Before you go, an opportunity to share with our audience any last thoughts, resources, or calls to action.
I will jump in and say, for those that are listening and interested in joining the Legal Defense Fund, we are going to have a lobby day where we are pushing for the VRA and against the bills that Emily and Veronika mentioned, as well as others, on April 23rd. So we'll be going to Austin and bringing our multiracial coalition there from across the state. We have buses available for people from Houston and Dallas, and we want you to join us. So we will look out for you to be there, and we'll share any info we can with Tatum to share on the Progress Texas podcast.
I will say that SB 16, the Texas version of the SAVE Act, has been voted out of the Senate and has been received in the House. It's been referred to House Elections Committee. So we could be seeing a hearing on that in the next couple of weeks, since it is a lieutenant governor priority. And I think that folks who are interested in keeping on top of, the many, many moving balls that are going in the air in the Texas legislature right now, please feel free to sign up for our Texas Legislative Action Network at TCRP. We'll keep you apprised of anything that's moving, ways that you can take action, specific legislators that you can reach out to, and just help you stay involved in this process, because everything moves really, really quickly, especially starting in April. And it can be hard to keep track of, even for us who are steeped in it all the time.
Yeah, I would add, follow all of our organizations on social media. If you're listening to this, you clearly already follow Progress Texas, so you've got great taste. And go ahead and follow LDF, Common Cause Texas, and the TCRP as well. Also, call your reps, call your senators, your state reps, state senators, and your U.S. senators. Tell them you oppose, tell your U.S. senators you oppose the SAVE Act. Tell your local reps and senators that you oppose SB 16. Tell them that you support HB 5258 and HB 2082, that you want those bills to get a hearing. We got to, I know that it can feel sometimes like shouting into the ether. I'm from Wichita Falls, Texas. I'm not sure my rep agrees with me on a single solitary issue, but they do listen. They do see how many people are calling in on things. And I think it's important to remind them, your reps and your senators work for you, not the other way around.
Final plug that I will say, if you can't get to the Capitol for any reason, the House allows online public comments on bills. And reps do actually read those and go through them. So even if you can't make it in person for any reason, that's a great way to show reps what you care about and your opinion on the issues.
When it boils down to it, that's what the VRA is all about, is connecting people to their power. And so let's finish this up. And thank you all so much for joining. Thank you, Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Christina M. the Texas Civil Rights Project's Voting Rights Policy Attorney, Veronikah Warms, and Policy Director for Common Cause Texas, Eby French, JD. Here at Progress Texas, we're in the business of countering the conservative disinformation machine that's largely responsible for the election of Donald Trump. But while that machine is funded by oil billionaires, tech billionaires, religious right-wing groups, and more, we rely mostly on everyday Texans who value our hard work and share our belief that a Texas that works for everybody is the Texas we want to live in. We don't do subscriptions or paywalls because we believe the message of progress is one that everyone should be able to access, learn from, and act upon. So if you've become a regular listener, we could use your support, and no amount is too small. small. Thanks to Megan Vasbinder, Pat Smothers, and Lisa Owens for their valued and ongoing support. Go to progresstexas.org/donate, and thank you for listening and for all you do to press progress forward here in the Lone Star State. See you next time. Thanks, y'all.